Hi, I'm Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. In the debate you're about to see, I go head-to-head with Iman Aiton of Black Lives Matter. As many of you will know, this is not the first time that we've crossed swords, and some of those exchanges have been rather fiery, to put it mildly. On this occasion, we debated whether the statue of the Bristol philanthropist Edward Colston, who has links to slavery, should be put into a museum or, in my opinion, it should be re-erected where it once stood before being toppled by a baying mob no different to the Taliban or ISIS. The Black Lives Matter movement, now exposed for its corrupt and fraudulent use of millions of dollars of donations, bears much in common with the Taliban and ISIS, as I explain in this debate. They are all year zero cultures. But it's worth noting on another point that for all the talk of the value of black lives, BLM say nothing about the black lives suffering and lost to modern-day slavery in Africa. And they say nothing either about the black lives lost at the hands of other black people in the USA and in the UK too. In London, for example, despite comprising just 13% of the population, almost half of all murder suspects and victims are black. According to CNN, hundreds of slaves are sold every year just in Libya alone. The hypocrisy of BLM is staggering. For some, it will simply be ignorance. For others, the race grifters, well, they're being deliberately disingenuous. In either case, they demonstrate why we should not try to dismantle or tear down the past. For who's to say that the next generation will not take issue with today's heroes and statues? For example, there are two statues of George Floyd in the US, one in New York and one in New Jersey. Would it be right if another mob descended upon those statues in a few years and toppled them? After all, if we are going to make moral judgments on a person's character and actions, is it not grossly offensive that New York and New Jersey have erected statues to Floyd, a violent criminal who served long prison sentences and who broke into a pregnant woman's home and put a gun to her belly? Anyway, that's enough from me. Here's the debate.
Time now for our big debate this morning. Bristol Museum has revealed plans to become the permanent home for the Edward Colston statue. You'll remember that one, toppled and pushed into Bristol Harbour during the UK's Black Lives Matter protests. A vote will take place today to decide whether the statue of the 17th century slave trader will go on display in Bristol's M Shed Museum permanently. Let's get more, should we? Iman Aiton from Black Lives Matter and Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Thank you both for joining us on the programme. Away you go.
Now being put into a museum. It's a very good thing. Why? Because it's a British
all right. Well,
artifact,
let me come in. All right.
For British museums, British.
Look, I'm not here to defend Colston, right?
Okay.
I mean, you know, the BLM agitators have tarnished and traduced the reputations of many great figures, from Churchill to Nelson to David Hume. One second, please let me have my chance, my dear. You know, and I'll always defend those characters. But Colston has got a very dark record when it comes to slavery, and so no one will defend that, even though, of course, he does have also a philanthropic side. People are complicated. History is complicated. My issue is with the toppling of the statue and the way in which it was toppled, with the frenzied baying mob attacking it in scenes reminiscent of the villagers going after Frankenstein with pitchforks and flaming torches, or even, you know, like the Taliban and ISIS attacking monuments and sculptures that they found offensive. And of course, there's a good deal of comparison there because, of course, like the Taliban, BLM and others want to try to erase our history, ban our books, decolonize our curriculums, police our speech. These are sort of year zero cultures which are very damaging to British identity and the sense of nationhood in this country. And all of this happened without public consent. We know from polling that only 13% of the public agreed with the manner in which this statue was toppled, even though 40% agreed with the statue being taken away. And of course, you also have to ask, what is the connection here? I would like to see the statue actually re-erected where it was, with all of the graffiti staying on it, all the vandalism there, to stand as a monument to a moment of national hysteria when the nation was gripped by a mass psychosis because of the death of somebody in another continent. George Floyd had nothing to do with the British story. His death had no relevance over here. But because of American culture and BLM agitators, the grievances of America were brought over here when we don't have anything like the race issues that America has. And it was a shameful moment in our history, and I think that's why the statue should go back to where it was.
Well, I do apologise for interrupting earlier. We do tend to get impassioned with these typical debates, Rafe. But I did want to say that 80% of Bristol wanted that statue removed. And like I said, I do have to reiterate the point. For over 100 years, it's been spoken about and criticised. So over 100 years, this has been an issue, and they have been ignored. So that's really crucial in understanding the context. So I understand and I appreciate the fact that you've spoken about balance and the fact that he is a good and bad person. We agree on that point, which is always a nice thing to be able to do during a debate.
Do you agree he was a good guy as well?
Of course, balance, right? And this is what I wanted to kind of lead on to in terms of the BLM movement and all of these different EDI initiatives. It's about injecting balance into the conversation, injecting that balance that has been ignored. So that's really important. And then we also have to touch on the fact that the Colston 4 were obviously let off. They weren't charged. And so that's another salient point that we have to introduce. When we talk about damage and the fact that you saw these kind of, this mob attacking this statue, well, let's be fair in terms of damage, several things. One was the fact that a really good argument was used. Apparently an art dealer valued the statue at 6,000 originally, and then after it was toppled, it went from 6,000 to 150,000 to potentially 300,000. This argument, can I just finish?
Well,
let me finish, please. Thank you. And this argument was actually used in court, and it worked. So
but
that's a really
hold on. We're talking about history.
Hold on, no, that was actually validated. That was actually validated. So it's. But
well,
can I finish,
validated
please?
it?
Can I finish, please? Secondly, so that was validated. That's a salient point. And then in terms of just kind of understanding that we're not actually trying to eradicate history, I've already mentioned balance, but I really think it's important that if people are so concerned about a statue of a slave trader who advocated for the torture, rape and murder of black people, and that's, can I finish, please? If that is at the heart of British culture, identity and the essence of being British, then one, that explains why we are still contending with racism 400 years later. That makes so much sense now. And of course, I do personally implore the British public to find somewhere else to get their self-esteem, with all due respect, as we now live in an inclusive environment. I'll leave it at that.
The public square is for everybody, and BLM do not have the right to take down statues without public consent. There was no vote for it. There was no decision about any of this. And that's what's the thing here. And if you expunge all of the bad elements from the public square, there'll be no reminders, for example, of slavery. People need to have in their daily lives a reminder of the good and the bad of society. And nothing in this world is binary either. And, you talk about balance. Balance is actually very important. Why on earth would BLM suddenly attack the statue of a 17th century slave trader? If you're genuinely concerned about black lives, you'll be protesting the fact that 7 in every 1,000 Africans today is living in slavery. 10 million people. So where were the protests? Where were the protests outside the Nigerian High Commission? Where were the protests outside the embassies of Sudan and Chad? Exactly. Let me finish, please, and go on. And also, it's also the hypocrisy here, because the same people who are calling for Colston's statue to be toppled are the same ones celebrating and revering the Benin bronzes, for example. The Benin bronzes were commissioned by and commemorate African slave owners, the most brutal slave owners in the world, and yet somehow those are to be celebrated, whereas Colston has to be demolished. And we had that film, The Woman King, out recently, another film celebrated by BLM, yet that celebrates the warriors of the Dahomey Kingdom, the most brutal slave-owning state in the world history, which not only captured and enslaved fellow Africans to sell to Europeans, but held even more slaves to serve themselves on their own plantations in Africa, and then had brutal human sacrifices of tens of thousands of people. Every year the sacrifice would go on. And somehow this is all forgotten about. And it's only Britain that has to somehow apologise for slavery. And that, I think, shows the lack of balance here.
We are almost out of time. 30 seconds each, please, to make your final point.
Thank you. So just in terms of where we are now, one, you spoke about America and England, the differences, overt racism versus covert. That needs to be thrown out there. Secondly, there is hypocrisy on both sides, both on the left and both on the right. And this is what we need to always talk about when talking about balance. We have to be fair. So I will agree on that point. point. There is hypocrisy on the left and on the right. And then in terms of why we do these things, we always have to remember that, of course, the statue is important for people like you, and this is why we've offered that opportunity for it to be in a museum.
30 seconds from you.
Well, firstly, this is the nicest debate we've had. This has been the most civil of many that we've had. All I would say is I think people need to have perspective and look at the broader picture. Britain is one of the world's 5 least racist countries. Real racism is alive and well in India, China, Africa. We should be, and America. We should be very proud to live in this country, which is far more tolerant even than any other European Union country, according to the EU's own report.
And yet you want to keep a statue of a slave trader.
So let's recognise and celebrate Britain led the world in abolishing the slave trade.
And yet you want to keep a slave trader.
We are out of time. It's good to talk to both of you. Let's see what happens. Perhaps come back and talk to us again after a decision has been made. Much